Let me tell you about the time the sun broke. Not in some ancient myth, not in some end-of-the-world prophecy carved into a temple wall. I am talking about a real, documented, verified moment in human history when people woke up one morning and the sun was the wrong color. It was blue. And the wildest part? Nobody cast a shadow that day. A Roman politician literally wrote those exact words. And that was just day one. What followed over the next 18 months, and then the next 120 years after that, was a cascade of suffering so total and so relentless. He did not say the Black Death. He did not say World War II. 536 AD. And most people alive today have never even heard of it. The world in early 536 was not some struggling backwater. It was thriving. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was a city of 500,000 people, and hands down, the most impressive place on earth. Aqueducts, massive churches, and an economy powered by trade routes connecting Egypt to India. Emperor Justinian was running the show, and this guy had ambitions. He had just sent his best general, Belisarius, to crush the Vandals in North Africa, which Belisarius did in about a year, because that is how dominant the Byzantine military was. Now, Justinian wanted Italy. Meanwhile, China had a massive population feeding millions, even while its dynasties fought each other. The Maya were building the most mathematically precise architecture the world had ever seen. Teotihuacan, near modern Mexico City, held over 100,000 people. Down in Peru, the Moche civilization had engineered the desert into farmland using irrigation canals that still impress engineers today. And in Scandinavia, Germanic tribes were trading gold across the Baltic. This was not a fragile world waiting to collapse. This was a world that was working. And then, one morning in March of 536, the sky broke. People in Constantinople noticed it first. Something was off about the light. There was a haze sitting over the city, thick and strange, and it was not burning away the way morning fog does. The sun was still technically visible, but it looked dim and sickly, like staring at the moon through dirty glass. Reports started coming in from all over. The Middle East, North Africa, parts of Asia. Everywhere the same story. A Byzantine historian named Procopius, who was basically Emperor Justinian's personal record keeper, documented this in real time. This was a senior government official whose literal job was to write down exactly what happened. And what he wrote was that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. He said it looked like the sun was stuck in a permanent eclipse. He wrote that during this time, men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. That is a man watching his civilization start to unravel in real time and putting it on paper. But Procopius was not even the scariest witness. 2 years later, in 538, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus, living near Ravenna in Italy, wrote a letter to one of his subordinates that reads like the opening scene of a horror film. He described a sun that had turned bluish in color, a moon that had lost all of its luster. He said at noon there were no shadows visible on the ground from anyone's body, which is physically insane when you think about it. The sun is supposed to be at its strongest at noon, and it was so dim that it could not produce a single shadow on the surface of the earth. He wrote about a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. Frost was forming during harvest time, hardening apples on the branch and turning grapes sour before they could ripen. He said because of famine, it was necessary to use stored food. That is a civilization eating through its emergency reserves. That is the ancient world equivalent of cracking open the last can of beans in the bunker and realizing nobody is coming to help. Chinese records from the Northern Wei dynasty documented snowfall in August of 536. August, in a region where summers normally hit scorching temperatures. The harvest was delayed, famine followed, and in some areas of northern China, accounts describe starvation so severe that people resorted to eating things I will not describe on this channel. Irish chronicles recorded a failure of bread lasting from 536 to 539, meaning 3 full years where grain simply did not grow. An Assyrian bishop named John of Ephesus wrote something that might be the most haunting eyewitness account from the entire period. He said the sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for about 18 months. Each day, it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. And then he added that everyone declared the sun would never recover its full light again. Sit with that for a second. These people genuinely believed the sun was dying. They had no meteorology, no satellite data, no explanation of any kind. They just watched the primary source of all life on Earth grow dimmer and dimmer, and concluded that the world was ending. And honestly, for a lot of them, it was. So here is the million-dollar question. What actually happened? Because for centuries, nobody had an answer. Historians read those ancient accounts from Procopius and Cassiodorus and mostly shrugged them off. They assumed it was poetic exaggeration, typical ancient writers being dramatic. Nobody took the shadow thing seriously. Nobody believed it snowed in China in August. And then, in the 1990s, a scientist named Mike Bailey at Queen's University Belfast did something beautifully simple. He looked at tree rings. The rings corresponding to 536 showed almost zero growth. Trees grow based on sunlight and warmth, and whatever happened in 536 robbed them of both so completely that the trees basically flatlined. And it was not just Ireland. The same pattern showed up in tree rings from Sweden, Finland, the mountains of California, and even in ancient trees in Chile. Whatever hit the world in 536 did not care about hemispheres or continents. It hit everything. The full picture did not come together until 2018. A team led by Harvard historian Michael McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski from the University of Maine went to the Swiss Alps and drilled a 72-meter ice core out of a glacier called Colle Nifferi. Think of an ice core like a time capsule. When they analyzed the layer from 536, they found massive deposits of sulfate and microscopic shards of volcanic glass. The fingerprint was clear. A catastrophic volcanic eruption, almost certainly in Iceland, had launched an enormous cloud of ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. That material formed what scientists call an aerosol veil, a blanket of particles that wrapped around the northern hemisphere and bounced sunlight back into space. Same thing that happened after Mount Tambora erupted in 1815 and caused the year without a summer. Except 536 was far worse, and it was just the opening act. The 536 eruption was not alone. Ice core data shows that another massive eruption occurred around 540, likely from the Ilopango caldera in El Salvador. This was not some minor blast. It was one of the most powerful eruptions of the last 10,000 years. And then, a third eruption hit around 547. 3 apocalyptic volcanic eruptions in roughly 11 years. Each one pumping fresh sulfate into an atmosphere that had not even begun to recover from the last one. The result was a stacking effect that scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of extreme cold that lasted from 536 all the way to approximately 660 AD. That is over a century of abnormal cold. Summer temperatures across Europe plunged by nearly 5 degrees Fahrenheit below normal, and in some regions, the drop was even steeper. 5 degrees does not sound like much until you realize what it does to food. Grain, which fed the vast majority of the ancient world, needs 3 things to grow: predictable seasons, adequate sunlight, and enough warmth to ripen. The volcanic winter of 536 eliminated all 3 simultaneously and kept them eliminated for years. Fields that had reliably produced wheat and barley for generations suddenly produced nothing. Livestock starved because there was no grass growing, no hay to store, no surplus grain to feed them. The entire food chain did not just get disrupted, it snapped. Communities that had been stable for decades or even centuries suddenly found themselves with nothing to eat and no prospect of the situation improving. People abandoned their farms and villages and migrated, searching desperately for any patch of land that might still be producing something. And into those abandoned, desperate, weakened communities came a visitor. Rats. The cold drove rodents that normally lived in fields and forests into human homes, searching for warmth and whatever scraps of food remained. And on those rats were fleas. And that detail, which sounds like a footnote, is actually the most important sentence in this entire story. Because in 541, 5 years after the sun went dark, those fleas delivered a package. Ships had been pulling into the Egyptian port of Pelusium for centuries, carrying grain from North Africa to feed Constantinople. But this time, the grain ships carried something else: black rats. And the fleas riding those rats were infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. You know it by another name: bubonic plague. It arrived at Pelusium quietly, the way the worst things always do. And then it detonated. By 542, it had reached Constantinople, and what happened next is one of the most nightmarish chapters in human history. At the peak of the outbreak, the plague was taking an estimated 5,000 lives every single day in Constantinople alone. 5,000 per day in one city. Bodies accumulated faster than anyone could deal with them. The Byzantine government ordered massive pits dug to pile the corpses in, and when those overflowed, they started stuffing bodies into the hollow towers of the city's defensive walls. They poured quicklite on top to try to speed decomposition. When even that was not enough, they loaded the dead onto boats, pushed them out into the Sea of Marmara, and set them on fire. The richest, most sophisticated city on earth smelled like death for months, and Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague, though unlike half his capital, he somehow survived. The Plague of Justinian, as history would name it, did not stay in Constantinople. It followed the trade routes outward, like fire following a trail of gasoline, into Persia, across North Africa, up through Italy and into Western Europe. Estimates of the total death toll range between 25 million and 100 million over the next 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks. The initial wave alone may have wiped out a quarter of everyone living in the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople lost close to half its population. Half the people in the greatest city on earth gone. The markets went silent. The tax revenue dried up because the taxpayers no longer existed. The farmers, the soldiers, the craftsmen, the sailors, the builders, all gone. An entire civilization did not just get wounded, it got hollowed out. And the military fallout was immediate. Before the plague, Belisarius had been unstoppable. He conquered North Africa in a year and was steamrolling through Italy. After the plague gutted the population, everything slowed to a crawl. The first Italian campaign took 5 years and ended indecisively. The second dragged on for 8 agonizing years, with Belisarius begging for reinforcements that never came because there was nobody left to send. the army started relying on barbarian mercenaries to fill the gaps. By 568, the Lombards invaded northern Italy, and the Byzantine grip crumbled. Justinian's dream of rebuilding Rome did not die on some glorious battlefield. It died in a sickbed, taken out by a bacterium, riding a flea, riding a rat, riding a grain ship from a port where the harvests had failed because the sun stopped shining. If a screenwriter pitched that chain of events, you would say it was too ridiculous to be real. But every link in that chain is documented. But here is what elevates this from a Mediterranean tragedy to a genuine global apocalypse. Every civilization on Earth was breaking at the same time for the same reason, and none of them knew about each other. In Scandinavia, the combination of unending cold, failed crops, and what researchers believe was plague reaching that far north caused population losses that some estimates put between 75 and 90% in certain regions. That is near total annihilation. Hundreds of farmsteads across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were simply abandoned. Entire villages went dark. The survivors were so desperate that Scandinavian chieftains gathered their most valuable possessions, gold rings and bracelets and ceremonial coins, and buried them. They threw them into bogs and lakes as sacrifices to the gods, begging for the sunlight to come back. Archaeologists have found these hoards and dated them precisely to the years following 536. And some scholars believe that the collective trauma of this period gave birth to Fimbulwinter, the great and terrible winter in Norse mythology that comes before Ragnarok, the destruction of the world. That myth might not be mythology at all. It might be a memory. Cross the Atlantic, and the story is just as devastating. The Ilopango eruption, around 540, detonated in the heart of Maya civilization, destroying settlements across El Salvador and triggering mass migrations. The broader climate crisis launched what scholars call the Maya hiatus, roughly 536 to 590, where construction at major cities like Tikal halted, wars erupted, and populations in some areas crashed by 70%. Further north, Teotihuacan entered a spiral of drought, food riots, and political collapse. Evidence suggests parts of the city were deliberately burned during uprisings. And in Peru, the Moche civilization faced its own nightmare. Ice cores show the climate disruption supercharged El Niño events, causing 30 years of flooding followed by 30 years of drought. Their irrigation canals were overwhelmed and then left dry. The Moche did not survive. And that is the detail that haunts me most. None of these civilizations had any idea the others were dying. A Maya king watching his city empty out had never heard of Constantinople. A Scandinavian chieftain burying gold in a frozen bog had no concept of a Moche farmer watching sand fill his irrigation canals. A Chinese farmer staring at August snow had never heard of Procopius or Justinian. They were all being destroyed by the same invisible force, and not one of them knew why. That is the part that stays with me. Not the death toll, not the plague. The loneliness. Every civilization thought they were suffering alone. They thought their gods had abandoned them specifically. They had no way of knowing the entire human world was going through the exact same thing. The long tale of 536 reshaped the entire planet. The Byzantine Empire never recovered its former power. Western Europe sank into the deepest stretch of what later historians would call the Dark Ages. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries collapsed, and stayed collapsed for generations. It took over 100 years for the economy to show signs of recovery. How do we know? Ice cores from those Swiss glaciers show a spike in lead pollution around the year 640. Lead was a byproduct of silver smelting, so its sudden appearance means people were mining and minting coins again. Commerce was restarting. But that was 640. The sun went dark in 536. That is 104 years of economic flatline. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody expects. The catastrophe of 536 did not just destroy the old world, it accidentally built the new one. When the Byzantine and Persian empires both emerged from this period battered and financially ruined, they left a power vacuum in the Middle East that had never existed before. In the early 7th century, a new force stepped into that vacuum: Islam. Within 100 years, an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia had been assembled at a speed that still stuns historians. Some scholars have drawn a direct line from 536 to the conditions that made that expansion possible. The climate chaos also pushed Turkic and Mongol tribes westward, setting off migrations that would define Eurasian politics for centuries. The Norse, traumatized by the darkness, would eventually become the Vikings. The world before 536 and the world after it were two completely different planets. There is something about this story that grabs you by the collar. We walk around with our satellites and climate models, thinking we have nature figured out. But 536 is a reminder that we do not. A single volcanic eruption in Iceland, combined with another in El Salvador, combined with a third one we still have not identified, brought the entire human species to its knees for over a century. No technology stopped it. No empire outran it. No prayer reversed it. The ash did not care about Justinian's ambitions or the Moche engineer's brilliance or the Scandinavian chieftain's gold. It rose, it spread, it blocked the sun, and then it watched everything beneath that sun come apart. The survivors did not have words for what happened to them. They did not know about sulfate aerosols or volcanic glass or bacterial pathogens carried by flea bites. They knew one thing: the sun went dark, and then everyone started dying. Their children went hungry, their neighbors disappeared, their fields turned to dust. Some of them prayed, some of them sacrificed everything they owned. Some of them just walked away from their homes and kept walking until they found somewhere, anywhere that had food. And then, slowly over decades and generations, they rebuilt. The grain eventually grew again. The plague eventually burned through its hosts and faded. The cold eventually broke. New kingdoms rose on the bones of the ones that had fallen. New trade routes stitched the fractured world back together. New stories were told around new fires. Stories about the time the sun died and the gods punished the earth. Stories that would echo through Norse sagas and Celtic legends and Chinese chronicles for 1,000 years. And now you know what actually happened. Not a legend, not a myth, documented, verified, proven history, backed by ice cores and tree rings and the handwritten testimony of people who stood outside at noon and saw no shadow beneath their feet. The year 536 is real. The 18 months of darkness are real. The plague that followed and the civilizations that fell are all real. And somehow, most people go their entire lives without hearing a single word about any of it. I spent weeks researching this, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like one of the most important stories in human history that nobody is telling. So I told it.
And if it hit you the way it hit me, if there was a moment in this where you felt something shift in the way you see the world, do me a favor, smash that like button so hard your phone feels it. Drop a comment and tell me which part got you. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit that subscribe button and the bell, because I promise you the next one is going to be just as wild. I will catch you there.